Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And I can scarcely believe it, but we are already in August. I simply have no idea where this year has gone. However, if we were able to time travel, which I'm sure is many people's dream, and we were able to go back to 1588, the August of that year would have been one of terror. In August 1588, England found itself under a greater threat to its sovereignty and governance than it had been under since arguably the Norman conquest of 1066. August was also the month where this threat dissipated. I'm talking about the Spanish Armada, and in today's video I'd like to think about its causes, events and aftermath. Let's look at it. As is the case with virtually every historical event, and particularly conflict, the causes are multiple. They are personal and private, but also public, national and international. They are about bruised egos and fear of national threat. They are political, religious and economic. And that is also the case with the Spanish Armada. But to look at its causes, we have to go back to the early 1500s. Now, Spain and England had not always been at loggerheads, as is shown by the marriage pact that Henry VII and Elizabeth of York arranged for their eldest son, Prince Arthur. He was to marry the Spanish Infanta, Katherine of Aragon, and all seemed well. With Arthur's premature death, negotiations then began for her to marry his younger brother, the future Henry VIII. Ultimately, Henry would marry her after his father's death. And all seemed well. There was a loving union. Henry and Catherine, England and Spain, until Henry believed that Catherine would not give him a son and heir. And suddenly he realised that he had to get out of his marriage. And in 1527 he began taking steps to do just that. 1527 was the official start date of the king's great matter. It's when he put in an application to have his marriage to Katherine of Aragon annulled. At this point, Katherine of Aragon is the aunt of the Emperor of Spain, Charles V. Henry's request was blocked by Katherine of Aragon, her nephew, and ultimately the Pope. At one point, the Pope was even in her nephew's custody. Charles V had sacked Rome, and so it was quite unlikely that the Pope was going to grant an annulment for a marriage that would directly affect the aunt of the man who essentially had him to ransom. So, in 1534, this personal matter becomes religious and political. The domestic and private becomes national and international. In 1534, Henry has himself acknowledged as the supreme head of the Church of England, signalling a break from Rome and the Pope, and similarly a break from all of mainstream Catholic Europe. With Henry's death in 1547, his son, Edward VI, ascends to the throne. He himself appears to have been a committed Protestant and also seems to have been surrounded by many members of his council who were also committed Protestants. In 1553, Edward VI, that Protestant king, passes away aged just 15. By this point, the head of his council is one John Dudley, and he is keen to avoid another Catholic monarch and a return to Rome. So his idea is to marry his son Guildford Dudley to one of Edward's relatives, Lady Jane Grey. She was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, and herself a committed Protestant. She is ultimately perhaps better known as the 9 Days Queen. She arrived at the Tower to be prepared for her coronation and never left it. Her reign was a short, unsupported failure. It would seem that for the vast majority of the English people, faith was of less importance than bloodline. They were most concerned with getting somebody with Henry VIII's blood on the throne than they were with a potential return to Rome. And so Henry's elder daughter, Edward's half-sister, Mary I, comes to the throne. She is a committed Catholic, and she goes about reversing her parents' divorce and also the split from Rome. In the following year, 1554, Mary marries her cousin Charles V's son, Philip. With Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, we could perhaps see it as a restoration of trust and friendship between these nations, much as when Arthur and then Henry had been matched with Katherine of Aragon. However, For the English people, Mary's sex made this problematic. With a Spanish king rather than a Spanish infanta as the marriage option, they had questions. Would England essentially be ruled by Spain? If wives must submit to their husband, is the same thing true when the wife is a regnant queen? And should Mary die, would that mean that Philip then ruled England after her death? Such was the distrust that the English had for this new Spanish match that protests broke out, and one nobleman, Thomas Wyatt, led a rebellion. He intended to block the marriage and, more than that, replace Mary with her half-sister Elizabeth. Rather than bringing back a trust between these two nations, a level of friendship that had been broken with the preceding events, Philip would have known that he was coming to an England that didn't want him. And while we may never know his precise feelings on the matter, one wonders how this reception might have affected the way he viewed England and the English in later years. There was high hopes that Mary was about to produce a Catholic heir to England, settling the question of religion once and for all. However, her purported pregnancies ultimately turned out to be, we believe, phantom pregnancies, or possibly a form of cancer that ultimately led to her death. In 1558, Mary dies without a child to succeed her. Her heir is therefore her half-sister, Elizabeth I, and she becomes queen. In the year after she accedes the throne, the year 1559, Elizabeth rejects her brother-in-law's proposal of marriage. Philip had wanted to keep England under his control. Elizabeth, it seems, was having none of it. Also in that year, the Act of Uniformity and the Act of Supremacy were passed. This meant that once again, England's faith identity had changed. They were Protestant, and now Elizabeth is named the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Also in this year of 1559, there were already rumours that Philip of Spain was considering invading Elizabeth's England in order to return it to Rome and to protect Catholics living there. In 1568, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, flees her Protestant nation in disgrace and fear. She arrives in England. Now, there is a potential rival Catholic claimant for Elizabeth's throne in her kingdom and being held under house arrest. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicates Elizabeth. What this means is, for Catholics in England, Elizabeth is no longer their sanctioned queen. According to the Pope, she is a false queen, who they can willingly depose and even execute. It's unclear what Pope Pius V was intending to achieve with this, but what it certainly did do was place the Catholics in England under an increasing amount of suspicion. Was it now possible to have a middle ground? Could Elizabeth get by without making windows into men's souls? Probably not, because to be a loyal Catholic now meant you could not be a loyal English person. The Pope has directly come out against your queen. He has said that she is false. He has excommunicated her. So it's almost impossible to be both a loyal, observant Catholic and also remain a loyal English person. If these suspicions did exist, it would seem that they were well placed. The following year, 1571, the Rodolphi plot is uncovered. This is a plan to depose and kill Elizabeth and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. Then, in the following year, in August 1572, word gets back to England of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris. The Roman Catholic nobility had gone about slaughtering Protestants in the streets and in their homes. The rivers and roads ran with blood. For people in England, this would have been terrifying. Their Catholic neighbours could, ostensibly, rise up against them, murder their queen, and also kill them, their wives, and their children. This had happened just across the Channel. Then, 1583, the Throckmorton plot is discovered, which again intended to depose Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. In the aftermath of the Throckmorton plot, Elizabeth's councillors, led by Francis Walsingham, were able to trade in fear and change the law. In the Parliament of 1584 to 85, they passed the Act of Association and the Act of the Queen's Safety. In both cases, this ensured that anybody who could be found to be complicit in plotting against the Queen's life would find their own life forfeit. Similarly, if somebody were plotting against the Queen's life and succeeded in order to put themselves on the throne, their claim to the throne would be rendered forfeit. As we will see, It will not be long before these new laws are put to the test in the most extreme way. In 1585, the usually anti-war, on account of her being parsimonious more than anything else, Elizabeth, is prevailed upon to send English troops to the Netherlands in order to protect Dutch Protestants from seemingly rising Catholic Spanish aggression. The troops are led by Elizabeth's favourite, Sir Robert Dudley, and it seems that Elizabeth puts Dudley under instruction that he is not to escalate the fighting. It would seem that Elizabeth still wants to negotiate with Philip and Spain. In 1586, the Babington plot finally sees the light of day. It would seem that Elizabeth's chief ministers had known about it for quite some time, and they had been working with the knowledge they had to entrap Mary Queen of Scots. They had willingly allowed her to send letters to Babington and his conspirators, and they had been reading them, decoding them, and building the case against her. In the aftermath of that law change, with the Act of Association and the Act of the Queen's Safety, the fact that Mary is unquestionably implicated in this plot against Elizabeth's life renders her own life forfeit. However, in 1586, Elizabeth knows that signing this death warrant will absolutely bring the wrath of Spain down upon her and her England, and so she avoids signing her death warrant. Elizabeth would have been aware that at this time, when the question of the death warrant is raging, that Philip of Spain is building his naval fleet. He, it seems, has plans to act against Elizabeth's England because of the way Catholics are being treated, the threat to Mary Queen of Scots, and also, in no small part, because of revenge. He wants to deal with the fact that Elizabeth's England has supported the Dutch Protestants against him in the Netherlands. So with all of this as a foundation, personal and national, international, religious, economic and political, as England entered 1587, they must have been aware they were sitting on a powder keg. On the 8th of February of that year, 1587, a match was struck. Mary Queen of Scots was executed at Fotheringay Castle. According to reports, Elizabeth was incredibly distressed and angry at the news. She had signed the death warrant on the explicit proviso that it was not to be delivered. Her council, at this time led by William Cecil, had gone against her wishes and delivered it anyway. And apparently, without her knowledge, her cousin lost her life. As I mentioned a moment ago, by 1586, Philip of Spain was already building his naval fleet for use against England if necessary. The next year, the same year that Mary Queen of Scots was executed, 1587, Sir Francis Drake goes to Cadiz. Drake is one of Elizabeth's privateers, which is a polite term for pirate. At Cadiz, Drake singes the King of Spain's beard. By this, he sacks the port and destroys much of Philip's fleet that's being held there. The ships are ruined, and any stores or provisions within them are either also destroyed or stolen in the name of England. So, if Elizabeth had held any hope of coming to some kind of peace accord with her former brother-in-law, by 1587 she must know that all of those hopes are dashed. And for Philip of Spain, what Prince of Europe, what Catholic king could stand by while another regnant Catholic queen is executed and a vast proportion of their shipping fleet is destroyed by another nation? He has to act. The fuse has been lit on the fire of war, and the Spanish Armada against England is mobilised. On the 25th of April, 1588, Pope Sixtus V blesses the banners of the Armada. In doing so, he, from the highest Catholic office in the land, is blessing the plan to overthrow Elizabeth and reinstate Roman Catholicism in England. Now, Philip of Spain and his Armada could set sail, secure in the knowledge that God would of course be on the side of their military campaign. With the events of 1586 and 1587, Elizabeth knows she isn't going to get her former brother-in-law, Philip of Spain, to come to the peace table. But she hasn't given up hope on his ally, the Duke of Parma. At this point, the Duke of Parma has brought his fleet to join with Philip's in the launch of the Armada. Nevertheless, she has her representative, Valentine Dale, in the Netherlands, talking to representatives of the Duke of Parma in an attempt to secure just such a peace. Ultimately, as we will see, that fails. On the 28th of May, 1588, the Armada had left Lisbon. By the 6th of July, those negotiations between Elizabeth's representative and the Duke of Parma's had fully broken down. The Armada was coming, and it was coming in full force. There were no more peace negotiations that were going to happen. Now England had to fight and pray. On the 19th of July, the Armada fleet was spotted in the English Channel from Cornwall. Later in that day, the Armada came across 66 English ships in Plymouth. For some reason, the Spanish commander decided not to attack them. Rather, they moved towards the Isle of Wight. On the 21st of July, 55 English ships went after the Armada. There was some brief but ultimately undecisive skirmishing. As darkness fell on that same night, Sir Francis Drake put out his lantern in an attempt to hide from the Spanish fleet. However, he had been at the head of the English fleet and had been guiding them using that lantern. Therefore, they were all sailing blind. The English fleet was therefore separated from one another, and as such could not pose a real threat to the Spanish Armada until they'd managed to regroup after daybreak. On the morning of the 29th of July, the English made a decisive move. The Armada had been anchored in open sea near Calais. They decided to send 8 fireships. Fireships were vessels that they intended to ruin by setting fire to them, unsurprisingly. And the intention was that by sacrificing these ships, they would burn the vessels they were attacking. As it turns out, they did not burn any of the Armada's ships, but the panic of seeing these flaming vessels coming towards them was sufficient to make the Armada separate from one another. Parts of the Armada attempted to form back up near the port of Gravelines. However, the English fleet, led by many explorers, privateers or pirates, had learnt a lot from their tangles with the Spanish. Their ships were light and quick and manoeuvrable, and at the Battle of Gravelines, the English fleet was able to do considerable, although not decisive, damage to the Armada. The parts of the Armada that survived the Battle of Gravelines did manage to escape into the North Sea. The winds, it seems, had turned against the Armada and pushed it north. The English fleet, despite apparently being out of ammunition, continued to give chase. Lord Howard of Effingham, who was in command of the English fleet, called off the pursuit. The Armada, by this point, was in the Firth of Forth. What occurred on the 9th of August 1588 was arguably the most defining moment of the whole Armada, and it took place without a single shot being fired. Elizabeth went to meet her troops at Tilbury in Essex. What she didn't know was by this point much of the threat of the Armada had already passed. Nevertheless, she gave what was arguably one of the most rousing speeches in all of history. My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself under God. I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and I think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which, rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, on a word of a prince, they shall be duly paid. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject, not doubting but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp and your valour in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over these enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people. Just 2 days after Elizabeth gave this speech at Tilbury, the men she had met with and spoken to were being disbanded and sent home. The threat of an invasion on English soil posed by the Armada, it seemed, had passed, for now at least. However, they couldn't relax. The Armada ultimately did not return home until October. It's perhaps a little hard to imagine how those 2 months must have been experienced in England by Elizabeth and her people. On the one hand, the ultimate pressing threat seems to have passed, and yet there's still its echo. They are waiting. Will the Armada regroup? Will this invasion on English soil actually come? Will it be when we aren't paying attention? So while there may have been celebrations, I imagine there would still have been a large degree of hypervigilance. As was often the case in Elizabeth's England, success was celebrated through painting, and that is also the case with the Armada. In 1588, this was produced. It is known as the Armada portrait. There are 3 extant versions of this painting. There's one at Woburn Abbey, one in the National Portrait Gallery, and one that hangs in the Queen's House on the original site of Greenwich Palace. It was formerly attributed to George Gower, although, according to the National Portrait Gallery, we should more appropriately list it as being by English artist, unknown. As you may be aware, Elizabeth is a big fan of symbolism in her portraits, and that is certainly on display here. Behind her are seemingly 2 windows, showing moments from the Armada. On the left, in calm seas, the English fireships are being ranged against the Spanish fleet, while on the right, the Spanish fleet is being tossed by storms. It would seem to represent that Protestant wind that blew in Elizabeth and England's favour against the Armada. At her right elbow sits her crown, symbolising her right to rule and her monarchy. She places her right hand on a globe. It has been stated that she is pointing to the Americas, particularly to Virginia, an area of the New World that has been named for her. Her ornate dress is decorated with pearls, and strings of pearls hang around her neck. Pearls were a symbol of purity and virginity. They connect with Cynthia, the goddess of the moon, and also Jesus Christ, who was known as the Pearl of the World. In this, Elizabeth is showing off her purity as England's Virgin Queen. In the bottom right-hand corner of the image is a mermaid. Mermaids were mythical beasts, known to inflame the lust of sailors and tempt them to their death. Is Elizabeth's seemingly supernatural might in the face of Spanish aggression being shown through this figure here? What is perhaps particularly striking is that despite the presence of this sailor-luring mermaid, the chaos of ships being wrecked by storm, and in the other image of fire ships being launched against the Armada, Elizabeth sits in the centre. Her face is calm and serene. With all the chaos that is going on around her and in Europe, it would seem that here Elizabeth is being presented as the Protestant Queen, a force of calm and goodness, in opposition to the chaos that was going on the continent, with the violence of the Spanish Inquisition and the division and conflict that was going on over religion. England may have been able to pat itself on the back, however rightly, as a relatively peaceful place in comparison. But what do you think of this topic? I'd love to see your ideas in the comments section down below, or come and find me over on my social media. I'll leave the link to that in the description box. You can follow me there and we can continue the conversation. Also, if you've got any ideas for video topics that you'd like me to do, then please leave that either in the comments section or over on my social media. I do hope you've enjoyed this video though and found it useful. If you did, then please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.